Yeah, so what we find is that um, people of African ancestry uh, who are who have been dislodged outside of the African continent, for the last 5 years, they have developed a sense of looking at African spiritual culture, what I'm calling it, for lack of a better term, as traditions, as spiritual systems, and I think those words and what they imply are incomplete. So, for instance, African peoples don't name themselves, in the way that we think of. So, for example, the Yoruba are not Yoruba. The Hausa people, the people that we call Hausa, call those other people Yaruba. Yaruba became Yoruba, right? The Igbo, not Igbo. The Arab people refer to them as Oyo Igbo, right? Meaning that kind of people, right? The Akan are not Akan, because the Akan were called Tong or Tonoa by the Mande people. Tonoa means locusts, right? And you know what locusts are? They're pests for farmers because they eat their crops. And so you have intra-African terminologies that are being used to call those people. In other words, Africans have ways of distinguishing. I am this and you're that, or I'm not that because you're this. And the same is true for their spiritual system of tradition. They don't name it; they live it.
So based on all the African terms we have been given to Africans by non-Africans.
Yes, you have these interpolated terms, meaning those that are given from without, like African, Negro, Black, and so on. But then you have intra-African naming. The Hausa called those people Yaruba, which became Yoruba. Um, and then, of course, when folks reach Cuba and Brazil, they refer to it as Lukumi or Nago, right? In fact, in Jamaica, which I just came from Jamaica actually 2 days ago, you have a place called Nago Hills, right? And so you have these terms being created by Africans. These are intra-African, right? Sort of naming, not the externalized, interpolated ones. They're kind of called Tong or Tonoa by the Mande people, right? Who live in the Savannah region in West Africa, which means locusts, right? Because they obviously there's some behavior or character from these Akan peoples that made the Mande people refer to them as locusts, meaning as pesky, right? As troublesome to farmers, right? And so you have intra-African naming, which to me is a deeply understudied and fascinating arena for people to, if they really want to do African history, they have to do intra-African history, meaning what kinds of histories are being created among the encounter and exchange between African peoples on their own terms, literally and metaphorically, right? So that's something that is really undervalued, underappreciated. And so when you think about African spiritual culture, then what I've come to realize is that people don't have names for things that they live, right? So when we call it Yoruba system or the Akan system or Akan religion or Akan tradition, what are we really doing? We are framing what people do organically and without naming, culture without names, as I call it or phrase it in the English language, that people naturally don't do, right? And so we give it a name and make it a thing rather than a lived experience because we are not in that experience, right? Because if we were, and in the language and in the cosmology, we'd just be living it.
So all right. So what I'm hearing I'm using a European term, the theological approach, right? Their experience is just to be instead of categorizing and try to structure. All right. Why does Vodun, I don't know what name to say now.
Well, voodoo.
Voodoo.
Mhm.
Why does Voodoo have such a bad name across the world?
Well, it's no different than Obeah, right? Which we know of. It's a Pan-Caribbean term, much like voodoo. And Obeah is known throughout the Caribbean region, right? And even it has migrated, for example, to England, where peoples from the Caribbean basin, particularly Jamaica, but not exclusively, have migrated to England and throughout that particular diaspora. And so terms like Obeah and voodoo, right? Which gives it sort of again the flair of being something that is the demonic inverse of Christianity, meaning it is the polar opposite of something that's pure, civilized, and holy. Um, because of a simple fact, African cultural norms and forms have to be the boogeyman, right? Has to be the demonic inverse in order for Christianity to appear pure, holy, and sacred. In other words, it has to be flipped. In other words, think of it this way. Think of it as, you want to make, someone feel awful. Then the way you do that is to make them essentially everything that they're not. It's to frame them as everything that they're not. And so, in order to make you feel good about what you do. And so it's the same kind of framing, right? They flip it. And they have to do that in order to get African peoples out of their righteous mind and out of their culture, norms, and form, because they know, meaning these European people who became white, they know that their so-called notion of fake or false superiority rests on getting African peoples out of their righteous mind, out of their sense of themselves. Because their sense of self and sanctity and even sanity rests on their power base in terms of who they are. And so by calling it voodoo, it was called voodoo or obeah because these were the weaponry against European empire, European slavery, and European predation and cannibalism, right? This was their power source. Planters throughout the Americas, slavers throughout the Americas were uneased and did not sleep well because of so-called obeah and voodoo, right? And so by making African people believe that their own spiritual culture, their own spiritual weaponry and technologies were in fact devilish or demonic, and this thing over here, Christianity, is pure, holy, and sacred, is to get people out of their power base. In other words, think of it this way, in a crude but hopefully helpful example. It's like, when children will dupe each other out of their money, they'll say, I'll give you, let's say a 10-year-old talking to a 3-year-old, and 10-year-old says, you have a nice, piece of paper there, which is a $100 bill. I'll give you all these shiny coins, which are dimes, right? But they're new. I'll give you all these shiny coins. And let's say it's about 100 dimes, right? For, that piece of paper, right? And the child would say, oh, really? All those shiny coins for this, partly, grayish, green, $100 bill, right? And so the child will take the shiny, quantity of coins for this $100 because the child is what duped into believing that this shiny thing, right, that appears shiny, right, is more alluring than that valuable but older and therefore more ancient, $100 bill that's wrinkly as a great grayish green, and that exchange is made. So that kind of duping, in poor metaphor, but I'm sure your viewers understand, is what happens. Getting people out of their righteous mind is how you get them out of their power base. How do you get them? Essentially, that's how you make someone a slave, right? Slavery, again, is a power dynamic. And this power of tug of war, you have to make the people who you want power over believe that their cultural norms and forms are their worst enemies. Keyword believe, right? And you do that by making something shiny and alluring and seductive being the what? Frame of weapons for desire, right? But not simply desire, but desire through violence, right? You'll desire this through violence, right? And so it's through that, or those processes, that we end up, people of African ancestry, seeing obeah as wickedness solely or only. Yes, it was wickedness for the overseer, wickedness and evil for the planter, right? Giving them a mirror image of who they are, right? Essentially, African spiritualities, in their more, unstained and unfettered form, on their own terms, it's not about good and bad, but it's about destroying destruction, right? It is offensive and defensive. It doesn't seek to cause a fight, but if you bring the fight, it will bring the fight back to you. And that's what so-called Obeah and Vodun did. But of course, these are power bases that these, European white folks were terrified about. In fact, all throughout the Caribbean in the 18th, 19th century, there were at least a dozen or more laws on obeah and so-called voodoo punishable by death. Now, you don't enact those laws for something that is superstition.
That's what I want to touch on, man. So if it's such superstition and such BS, why were they so terrified of it?
Because it was real. Planters were vomiting, choking on their own vomit. Planters were not waking up from sleep the next morning. Planters were having their skin just turn, to ash and just crumbling, right? And so they were terrorized, right, by a terror for which they could not stop. Because it wasn't a terror that was simply brought on by bearing arms. It was a terror that was brought on by, axe and machete wielding, insurgentists, right? And you had those in terms of revolts and rebellions. But it was a terror that was unseen but felt, that was known but you can't taste, touch, or see. That is the worst terror. An enemy you can't see is the most terrifying, restricting kind of force that one could have.